Lockean limitarianism and the distributist telos of bioriginal sovereignty. Natural rights, wealth caps, and the constitutional horizon of Pacifica. Abstract. This essay advances a comprehensive reinterpretation of John Locke's theory of property as the philosophical foundation for a modern doctrine of limitarianism, understood as the principled capping of excessive wealth and asset accumulation, and argues that this doctrine finds its institutional telos in distributist political economy within bioriginal sovereign entities such as the proposed polity of Pacifica. Against both right Lockean absolutist readings and left Lockean collectivist appropriations, the analysis reconstructs Locke's labor theory of acquisition as a conditional natural right bounded by the no spoilage and enough and as good provisos, provisions that are neither archaic nor obviated by monetization but instead demand dynamic institutional enforcement under modern conditions of capital accumulation, financialization, and ecological scarcity. Limitarianism is defended as the legitimate constitutional mechanism by which Lockean provisos are translated into positive law, preserving economic freedom as non-domination while preventing oligarchic enclosure and opportunity hoarding. Drawing on distributist theory, Chesterton, Belloc, modern limitarian scholarship, secession theory, bioriginalism, and contemporary critiques of inequality, Piketty, the essay develops original contributions including a formalization of the Lockean provisos as opportunity set constraints, the concept of moral waste, as a generalization of spoilage, and the framing of Pacifica as a Lockean state of nature 2.0. The argument culminates in a hypothetical Pacifican constitutional architecture that synthesizes natural rights, wealth caps, and decentralized governance, offering a libertarian progressive model of sovereignty suited to Cascadian ecological and cultural conditions. Introduction. Few concepts in the canon of political philosophy have been as persistently invoked and as deeply contested as John Locke's theory of property. From its role in legitimating liberal capitalism to its appropriation by egalitarian critics, Locke's account of self-ownership and labor mixing in the Second Treatise of Government has served as a fulcrum for debates about wealth, inequality, and the moral limits of acquisition. The interpretive divide between so-called right Lockeans and left Lockeans has tended to harden around a familiar axis, whether Locke's provisos, most notably the requirements of no spoilage and enough and as good, left for others, are merely historical curiosities satisfied once money enters the scene, or enduring normative constraints that continue to bind property claims in perpetuity. The stakes of this dispute are not merely exegetical. They bear directly on the legitimacy of extreme wealth concentration, the moral status of inherited capital, and the constitutional architecture of contemporary political orders. This essay intervenes in that dispute by advancing what may be called Lockean limitarianism, a reconstruction of Locke's property theory that treats limitarian wealth caps not as external egalitarian impositions but as the natural institutional expression of Lockean proviso compliance under modern economic conditions. Limitarianism, in this sense, is not an ethics of enforced equality but a doctrine of bounded sufficiency grounded in natural law, aimed at preserving the baseline independence and opportunity that makes self-ownership meaningful for all. The argument proceeds from the premise that money, far from dissolving the provisos, intensifies the moral urgency of their enforcement by enabling indefinite accumulation, abstraction from use, and systemic forms of spoilage that Locke could not have empirically observed but clearly anticipated in principle. The essay further contends that distributism, as articulated by G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, represents the most coherent institutional telos of Lockean limitarianism. Distributism's insistence on widely diffused productive property, smallholder primacy, and guild-based economic organization operationalizes the enough and as good requirement at the level of constitutional defaults rather than discretionary charity or after-the-fact redistribution. This synthesis is then situated within the context of bioriginal secessionism, with particular attention to the Cascadian Pacifica framework, a proposed sovereign entity encompassing the Pacific Coast biorigin, oriented toward ecological stewardship, decentralized governance, open-source technological culture, and civil liberties including psychedelic autonomy. Pacifica is presented not merely as a political aspiration but as a constitutional laboratory in which Lockean limitarianism can be tested under conditions of scale, ecological constraint, and post-industrial economic complexity. By integrating natural rights theory, economic analysis, and constitutional design, the essay aims to demonstrate that Lockean limitarianism offers a principled libertarian progressive synthesis capable of resisting both plutocratic enclosure and bureaucratic overreach, while providing a philosophically rigorous foundation for new forms of sovereign experimentation in the 21st century. Exegesis of Lockean natural rights and the acquisition provisos. Locke's theory of property begins from a deceptively simple premise: every individual has a natural property in his or her own person, and the labor of that person's body and the work of their hands are properly their own. Second Treatise, section 27. From this axiom of self-ownership, Locke derives the legitimacy of original appropriation. When an individual mixes their labor with something held in common by nature, they remove it from the common stock and make it their private possession, without requiring the consent of others. This move, often treated as the linchpin of liberal property rights, is in fact tightly constrained by conditions that Locke treats not as optional moral aspirations but as constitutive limits on rightful acquisition. The first of these is the no spoilage proviso. Locke insists that one may appropriate from the commons only so much as one can use before it spoils, for nothing was made by God for man to spoil or destroy. Section 31. While early commentators often read this proviso narrowly, as a restriction tied to perishable goods in a pre-monetary agrarian context, such a reading fails to capture its deeper moral logic. Spoilage, for Locke, is not merely physical decay but the wrongful conversion of common resources into exclusive claims that serve no genuine human use. Once generalized, the proviso condemns not only rotting apples but idle landholdings, speculative hoarding, and forms of wealth that exist solely as instruments of domination rather than as means of sustaining life and industry. Moral waste, in this sense, is any pattern of accumulation that forecloses access to resources necessary for others' subsistence or independence without corresponding productive justification. The second constraint, the famous enough and as good proviso, requires that appropriation leave sufficient resources of comparable quality for others. Section 33. This condition has been the focal point of intense scholarly dispute. Robert Nozick, in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, famously argued that the proviso is satisfied so long as others are not made worse off than they would have been in a state of nature, a reading that effectively renders almost any market-driven inequality permissible provided it arises through voluntary exchange. Critics such as Jeremy Waldron and Eric Mack have countered that this interpretation collapses the proviso into a minimal Pareto constraint, stripping it of substantive egalitarian force. More recent scholars, including Andrew van der Heijden, have emphasized sufficiency and opportunity-based readings, according to which the proviso requires that others retain access to a threshold level of resources and life chances necessary for meaningful agency. The limitarian interpretation defended here builds on these sufficiency-based accounts while extending them dynamically. The enough and as good proviso is not a one-time check performed at the moment of original appropriation, it is an ongoing condition that must be satisfied across time as economic structures evolve. Locke himself gestures toward this temporal dimension when he acknowledges that the introduction of money, by mutual consent, allows individuals to accumulate more than they can personally use without violating the no spoilage proviso, precisely because money does not decay. Section 50. Crucially, however, Locke does not claim that money abolishes the enough and as good requirement. Rather, he assumes, problematically, as history has shown, that the availability of money in markets will expand overall productivity sufficiently to preserve opportunity for all. Under conditions of modern capitalism, characterized by financial abstraction, rent extraction, and inherited wealth, this assumption no longer holds. When accumulation enables some to command orders of magnitude more resources than others, not for productive use but for positional advantage, the proviso is violated even if aggregate wealth increases. Economic freedom, properly understood, is not merely the absence of interference but the presence of non-domination, a condition in which individuals possess sufficient independent means to refuse exploitation and participate as equals in social cooperation. Lockean natural rights, on this reading, entail not only freedom to acquire but an obligation to structure acquisition so that baseline independence is preserved for all. 2. Limitarianism is the institutionalization of the provisos. If the Lockean provisos are to retain normative force in a monetized, globalized economy, they must be translated from abstract natural law into concrete institutional forms. Limitarianism performs precisely this function. At its core, limitarianism holds that there is a morally justifiable upper bound on the amount of wealth or resources an individual may control, beyond which additional accumulation is unjust because it violates others' claims to sufficiency and opportunity. Unlike egalitarianism, which often aims at equality of outcomes, limitarianism is concerned with preventing the pathological extremes of accumulation that undermine the social conditions of freedom. Locke himself provides the conceptual bridge from natural law to positive regulation when he notes that property rights are always exercised within a framework of civil society and law, established for the mutual preservation of life, liberty, and estate. Section 124. The consent that legitimates money does not confer carte blanche to harm others, it presupposes ongoing compliance with the ends of society. Where accumulation becomes injurious, by enclosing access to land, housing, capital, or political influence, it forfeits its moral warrant. Limitarian policies, such as progressive taxation culminating in effective caps on net worth, inheritance ceilings, and maximum asset holdings, can thus be understood as the civil enforcement of Lockean conditions rather than their negation. Consider a stylized example. Suppose a modern polity imposes a 100% marginal levy on net wealth above a threshold of $20 million, with excess value redirected into a universal basic assets fund providing capital grants for housing, education, and enterprise. Such a policy does not confiscate legitimately acquired property in the Lockean sense, it delineates the boundary at which further accumulation ceases to be legitimate because it no longer serves productive use or preserves, enough and as good, for others. From a Pikettian perspective, unchecked accumulation tends toward R greater than G, the condition in which returns on capital outpace overall economic growth, leading to dynastic inequality and opportunity hoarding. Translated into Lockean terms, this dynamic represents a systemic violation of the provisos, as future generations are born into radically unequal opportunity sets. The limitarian response is not punitive but preservative. By ensuring optimal circulation of wealth and preventing moral waste, caps enhance rather than diminish economic vitality. Innovation and effort remain rewarded up to a point sufficient to secure comfort, security, and even opulence, but not to the extent that others are rendered structurally dependent. In formal terms, the provisos may be expressed as a constraint on opportunity sets. For all persons I and j within a polity, the opportunity set O_I must not fall below a threshold lambda relative to O_j, where lambda represents the minimum ratio consistent with non-domination. Limitarian institutions function to enforce this constraint over time, adjusting as technological and ecological conditions change. 3. Distributism as the Lockean telos. While limitarianism specifies the negative boundary of just accumulation, distributism articulates the positive institutional form that bounded property ought to take. Developed in the early 20th century by thinkers such as Chesterton and Belloc, distributism rejected both concentrated capitalism and state socialism, arguing instead for the widest possible distribution of productive property. The oft-quoted slogan, 3 acres and a cow, was not a pastoral fantasy but a concrete expression of the belief that economic freedom requires ownership, not merely wages or welfare. From a Lockean perspective, distributism may be understood as the telos of the enough and as good proviso. Where limitarianism prevents excessive enclosure, distributism ensures that the commons, once enclosed, is enclosed by many rather than by few. Smallholder agriculture, worker-owned enterprises, cooperative guilds, and family-scale businesses are not merely culturally appealing, they are the institutional arrangements most consistent with preserving self-ownership in practice. When individuals own productive assets, they are less vulnerable to domination and more capable of exercising the independence Locke associates with natural freedom. Distributism also offers a corrective to the tendency of limitarianism to be misconstrued as purely redistributive. The distributist emphasis on predistribution, structuring the economy so that ownership is widespread from the outset, aligns with the Lockean insistence that justice in property arises at the moment of acquisition, not merely through after-the-fact correction. Constitutional defaults can play a decisive role here. For example, a presumption of worker ownership in new enterprises, maximum acreage limits for landholdings, and preferential financing for cooperatives all serve to operationalize the provisos without continuous state intervention. In this sense, distributism is not an alternative to liberalism but its fulfillment. It takes seriously Locke's claim that the end of government is the preservation of property broadly understood, including the material conditions necessary for personal independence. By embedding distributive norms into the basic structure of the economy, distributism transforms the abstract moral equality of persons into a lived social reality. IV. Pacifica as a constitutional laboratory. The theoretical synthesis of Lockean limitarianism and distributism acquires particular salience in the context of bioregional secessionism. Locke is explicit that political obligation is conditional. When a government systematically violates the trust placed in it to secure natural rights, the people retain a right to alter or abolish it. Section 222. Bioregional movements, which seek to align political boundaries with ecological realities, can be understood as contemporary expressions of this Lockean principle. They arise from the recognition that centralized nation-states often fail to steward local resources or reflect the values of distinct ecological communities. Pacifica, envisioned as a sovereign entity encompassing the Cascadian bioregion and adjacent Pacific coast territories, represents a paradigmatic case. Its foundational ethos emphasizes ecological sovereignty, decentralized governance, technological openness, and civil liberties. Within such a polity, Lockean limitarianism provides a coherent framework for constitutional design. A hypothetical Pacifican constitution might include a preamble affirming that property rights are grounded in labor and bounded by the no spoilage and enough and as good provisos, an article on property limiting individual landholdings to, say, 500 acres and imposing a superfluity tax of 90% on wealth exceeding defined thresholds, and an economic bill of rights establishing sectoral guilds for fisheries, forestry, renewable energy, psychedelic medicine, and open-source software development. These provisions are not utopian abstractions but practical responses to concrete risks. Consider the enclosure of Oregon's forests by a single billionaire, acquiring vast tracts not for sustainable use but for speculative appreciation or exclusive recreation. Such an enclosure violates both provisos. It constitutes moral waste by excluding productive use and denies others access to, as good, land for housing, livelihood, or ecological stewardship. A Pacifican distributist regime would prevent this outcome ex ante, ensuring that forests are held by cooperatives, indigenous trusts, or commons institutions accountable to local communities. Economically, a seceded Pacifica operating at bioregional scale would be better positioned to enforce limitarian norms than a sprawling federal system subject to regulatory arbitrage. Cascadian rail cooperatives, ethnobotanical trusts managing psychoactive plant resources, and publicly chartered but worker-owned technology platforms exemplify how innovation and constraint can coexist. Pacifica, in this light, becomes a Lockean state of nature 2.0, not a pre-political wilderness, but a consciously constituted order that reasserts natural rights against the distortions of imperial scale and financial abstraction. V. Objections and rebuttals. Several objections to Lockean limitarianism merit careful consideration. The first charges that wealth caps are inherently anti-libertarian, violating the right to the fruits of one's labor. This objection misunderstands the argument. Limitarianism does not deny the right to acquire, it specifies the conditions under which acquisition remains rightful. Once accumulation undermines others' baseline independence, it ceases to be an exercise of liberty and becomes an instrument of domination. A second objection concerns incentives. Critics argue that capping wealth will dampen innovation and effort. Empirical evidence from societies with strong distributist elements, however, suggests that motivation persists so long as individuals can secure comfortable and meaningful lives. Locke himself emphasizes that labor is motivated by the desire for improvement, not infinite accumulation. Beyond a certain threshold, additional wealth yields diminishing marginal utility for the individual while imposing increasing social costs. A third objection questions feasibility. Implementing limitarian-distributist regimes at scale is undeniably challenging. Yet bioregional polities like Pacifica offer a promising context precisely because of their manageable size, cultural cohesion, and ecological specificity. Enforcement is easier where capital cannot easily exit without abandoning the very resources, land, water, community, on which its value depends. Conclusion. Lockean limitarianism, properly understood, is neither a betrayal of liberal principles nor a concession to collectivism. It is a rigorous interpretation of natural rights that takes Locke's provisos seriously in a world transformed by money, capital, and ecological constraint. By insisting that property rights remain bounded by the requirements of no spoilage and enough and as good, limitarianism preserves economic freedom as non-domination and guards against the oligarchic enclosure that threatens both liberty and democracy. Distributism emerges as the institutional telos of this framework, translating abstract moral limits into concrete patterns of ownership that sustain independence across generations. When embedded within bioregional sovereign projects such as Pacifica, this synthesis acquires constitutional form, offering a libertarian progressive model of governance attuned to ecological reality and technological possibility. Pacifica, conceived as a Lockean state of nature 2.0, illustrates how secessionist experimentation can revive the moral core of liberalism by rerouting it in natural law, sufficiency, and shared stewardship. The task ahead is not merely theoretical. It calls for the drafting of constitutions, the design of economic institutions, and the cultivation of civic cultures capable of sustaining bounded freedom. In this endeavor, Locke remains not a relic but a guide, pointing toward a future in which property once again serves its original end, the preservation of free and equal persons in a common world.